This episode is sponsored by Smart Travel, a new podcast from NerdWallet. You know that one friend who always finds the best travel deals, picks the right cards, and somehow ends up in first class for the price of coach? How do they do that? Well, Smart Travel is like that friend, but in podcast form. They cover all things travel finance, like which travel cards earn their keep and which are just heavy, shiny metal, and planning group trips that won't ruin your budget or your friendships. So travel smarter and spend less. That's the key with help from NerdWallet. Follow Smart Travel wherever you get your podcasts. Armchair-Explorer is a part of the Voyescape podcast network. Check out all of their shows from around the world at voyescape.com. Hey guys, welcome to Armchair Explorer. My name's Aaron Miller. I'm a travel writer and your host. And today we're going to showcase one of our connection episodes. If you haven't checked these out before, these are basically like our deep dive interviews with people that we think are really cool and really interesting. And today is a conversation with a guy called Alastair Humphreys, who is more than cool and interesting. He's basically a legend in the world of adventure. You probably heard of him, but if you haven't, I'm going to steal this from his bio. Check it out. Alastair's quest for adventure began young. Age 9, he completed the 20-mile Yorkshire Three Peaks Challenge, then the National Three Peaks Challenge in 24 hours, age 13. At 15, he cycled off-road across the entire length of England, and then while he was still at university, he cycled from Pakistan to China, Land's End to John O'Groats, Turkey to Italy, Mexico to Panama, and perhaps best of all, he ran the London Marathon dressed as a rhino. But while at university, he started to get this itch, this craving. He wanted to do something big. And so this story really begins, this interview, with that point in time, that moment when he's just about to set out on that adventure. So I'm going to get to that in just a second. But just so you know, we did an episode with Alastair the 18th of December, 2023. I checked, so you could just scroll back to that exact date if you want to. And we produced that one in our kind of signature adventure documentary format. If you're familiar with the show, these are like our original style where basically the guest talks, I talk, we script it all together, we add music and sound design. I love them. They're really focused on the core story, the core adventure itself. But the problem is you inevitably have to leave lots of stuff on the cutting room floor because there just isn't space in that episode for everything he talks about in the interview. So in this interview, I'm bringing all that back and showcasing the full interview, just me and Alastair sitting down, having a chat. And what a chat it is. So if that inspires you, go and check out his website, alastairhumphreys.com. He's written so many amazing books. I've read a few of them. They're great, including his book about micro-adventures, which is where he basically lays out the whole idea. Definitely get that. That is an inspiring read. And his latest book, at least when we talked here, which is called Local, and that's all about exploring on your doorstep, which is really inspiring too. So here's my chat with Alastair, and it begins with me basically quoting a paragraph that he wrote for Backpacker magazine a couple of years ago. And it's about that moment. It's about why he decided to set off and cycle around the world. That was like the big thing that he decided he was going to do after he graduated university. He was going to cycle around the whole world. And this is what he said about it. I let go of everything that makes life secure, normal, and conventionally happy. I didn't think I'd find it there. And here's what he meant by that. I hope you enjoy.
I think I was just trying to dare myself to shake off the comfortable shackles of having a really nice, normal, happy, friendly, safe life, really, which I know for billions of people would sound utterly ridiculous, but I think I just wanted to try and dare myself to try and make things a bit more difficult and uncertain for a while in some sort of optimistic gamble that doing so would eventually lead to some sort of happiness or fulfillment or all these sorts of things that send us off exploring around the world.
Yeah, and with that in mind, there, you also kind of quote, I think it's Candide, is it, I believe, where he has this kind of funny quote about wanting to know what it's, you know, to get your buttock cut off or something like that, I believe. But the sentiment of that was, you just never know, really. Like, I think that there's this sense that, you know, the path that we're set upon in modern life is the route to happiness. But if you don't ever try and step out of that path, you never really know. Is that, I mean, you put that quote in there, so it's obviously something you resonate with, but could you explain why you put that in there and like what you mean by that?
Yeah, I certainly felt, and it's interesting now because I'm a lot older and a lot lazier than I used to be. So these days, I think I can find a good deal of happiness with a comfortable chair, a good book, and a cup of coffee. But certainly in the days when I was driven to want to go and cycle around the world, I really felt quite strongly that I needed to earn the right to sit in that comfortable chair and drink that cup of coffee and to sort of earn and appreciate that. And you do that by putting yourself through some arbitrary, difficult, hard challenges. I suppose it's no different really to why a lot of people might sign up to, say, a marathon or something. I mean, running a marathon is a miserable experience. You don't do it because you're enjoying it. You do it because of how you will feel afterwards and the things that you will learn about yourself in the process. And travel, for me, certainly when I began, was very much about pushing myself hard to deliberately have a masochistic, ascetic, fairly miserable sort of experience in the expectations that when I came back, that hot shower and the comfy bed would really feel great and I would actually appreciate them for once rather than taking everything for granted.
For a lot of people, to do that, to go against the kind of norms of modern society is a very hard decision to make. Was it hard for you in some ways? And what would be your message to those people to, you know, to go for it anyway?
It was hard for me to decide to try and do things different to what everyone around me was doing and also what society and perhaps my parents might have expected and hoped that I would be doing. So I did find that hard. But I also was really conscious that it was much easier for me than it would have been for a lot of people. And I felt very privileged that I had some opportunities to go do adventurous stuff, and that whilst my parents would probably have preferred that I got a proper job, they were at least willing for me to go and do this sort of stuff, and the assumption that eventually I would get the proper job. So I think looking back, I feel very grateful that I managed to dare myself to get out the front door and begin. And I would really urge anyone who's daydreaming of some sort of adventure to go if you possibly can. Try it. The worst thing that will probably happen is that you decide you hate it and then you just come home and you get on with life as it was, but at least you've ticked off one of those unknowns from the list and you don't have to go through life thinking, what if? So you've ticked that off. But, you know, you probably will love it. And if not, you will almost certainly just appreciate it and it will be a valuable learning experience for all of life, I think.
Well, as a fellow writer, I can say that you never got that proper job, but I'm sure your parents are very proud of you and everything that you've achieved. So I'm always curious when I speak to people that have done a really big adventure like this. What is that moment of the starting line in those first few miles that you pedal out? It must be quite daunting, quite surreal, quite liberating. You have this beautiful quote when you talk about going from someone that's been dreaming of a journey to someone who was on the journey.
I'm often struck when I see online people beginning their own adventures, and quite often people have a big gathering of all their friends and family and everyone claps and cheers and then they cycle off down the road. And I think that's great. I did not want to do that at all because I didn't feel any sense of celebration or excitement before I set off to cycle around the world. I felt, if anything, like a condemned man, a prisoner who is being shipped off to exile. I felt a fraud, being convinced that I was going to quit very soon, an imposter, that I was totally out of my depth. I was claiming to do something that I had no idea how to go about doing. And I felt very little sense of joy or liberation. I just felt horrible, really. And I felt like that at the start of most of my big adventures. But soon after that, once you actually get going and you get over this sort of the sadness or the fear, then comes the thrill, the sort of looking around you as you pedal down the road thinking, wow, it's Monday morning and I have nothing to do today except pedal as far as I can. The whole world is out there waiting for me. Who knows what I will meet or who I'll meet next, where I'll go. Who knows where I'm going to sleep tonight. I've got no idea what my next meal is going to be. I am free. I'm the king of the world. And that's the great side of it. But for me, it doesn't come immediately. I definitely find starting trips quite a frightening, unsettling experience.
I think that's really interesting. It gives me hope because I can absolutely relate to that, even though I'm much smaller scale of the stuff that I do. But I wonder if we could just pick out a couple of scenes, if you like, a couple of moments, starting at the start of the journey, whether it's Europe or Africa. Is there something that really stood out to you as a moment that you would share?
A pretty pivotal moment, not just for me on my little journey, but actually for the entire planet, was just 2 weeks into my bike ride. So when I set off, my plan was to cycle to Australia, and I'd done all my planning and preparation about how to cycle to Australia. So through Europe, and then I was going to be in Central Asia in the winter. So I had all sorts of good clothes ready for that freezing weather. And I was excited about visiting wonderful, exciting places like Afghanistan. And then 2 weeks into my bike ride, the 9/11 attacks happened in America, and the whole world changed. And suddenly my lovely scenic bike ride through Afghanistan didn't seem like such a fun idea anymore. So all of my planning and preparation then went completely out of the window. And when I got to Istanbul, instead of using the Iran and Pakistan visas in my passport, I had to start chasing around embassies to try and get a visa for Syria, for Lebanon, for Sudan, and set off to cycle down to South Africa. I had to buy myself a pair of flip-flops and post home my winter jacket. And I think what was interesting about that entire experience was that if you told me that I had to go cycle down Africa essentially with no planning at all, just literally wing it and make it up, I would not have dared do that. But all my planning and preparation that I did back in the UK, that gave me the nerve to get out the door and start cycling. And then all of that planning preparation went out the window. But by then it didn't matter because I was already in motion. I had some momentum, some confidence, and I've realized then that actually cycling around the world is exactly just like cycling for a weekend. You just cycle down the road. When you get tired, you put up your tent. Next day you cycle again, and you just repeat that for as long as it takes. You'll get around the planet, and you can just cycle down Africa and make it up as you go along. But I needed the practical, pragmatic planning to get me out the front door in the first place.
Africa is one of those places there's just a feeling to it. They call Africa the mother. There's some kind of special feeling to being there. What was the route that you took? It's such a varied continent, of course.
So I rode through Europe, then through the Middle East to Egypt, and then I cycled down through Egypt, Sudan, through Ethiopia, then Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Swaziland, Lesotho, down South Africa, down to Cape Town. I think a moment that really resonated me with that was at the time I was cycling through, Sudan had a really bad reputation of being a dangerous place to go, and everyone was warning me about Sudan. And on top of security fears was the fact that once you got beyond Lake Nasser, there was no road across the Nubian desert. It was just crossing an empty desert for about 3 weeks until I could reconnect with a road near Khartoum. That's now all tarmac, the entire thing. But back in my day, it was a full desert crossing. So I was very worried about two things that I felt were beyond my control, the desert and the security. But immediately upon arriving in Sudan, my worries about the safety of the country just evaporated. At that point, had never been to a place that was just so clearly joyful and welcoming and trusting. And the people I met there were just incredibly kind, even on a scale of all the lovely, kind people that myself and all people who travel tend to experience. So I love that aspect. And it just felt like a really liberating thing. It's weight off my shoulders of, oh, fantastic. This is going to be a great place. The only thing I need to worry about here is a desert. And wow, actually a desert is pretty exciting. I've never done something like this before. And I camped out on the sand for the first night, and I was just so excited. And from then on, Africa felt to me like an exciting opportunity rather than a scary hurdle to be overcome.
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? Those places that seem so distant from our culture, perhaps, or maybe in cases like Sudan are portrayed a certain way in the media. When you actually go there and you meet people, people are just people, aren't they? And there's generally so much kindness and welcome in the world that maybe we don't always expect. Is that something that you found throughout your journey? Is there anywhere else? Maybe, South America, I just love. I know you probably went through Patagonia and places like Peru and the Andes. That must have been spectacular as well, and so very different coming from Africa.
South America felt like a new beginning for me, and in some ways it was. I'd been gearing up from my front door to eventually get myself to Table Mountain at South Africa, all in one push, really. And from there, I crossed the Atlantic by sailing boat, and then I started again at the very southern tip of Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego, the town of Ushuaia, and that really felt like a new beginning. Everything I'd done till now felt like it was inconsequential, really, because I was right back at mile zero, and I was going to try and cycle to Alaska, and that was a heck of a long way, more than a third of the circumference of the globe away. So that very much felt like a new beginning. But in the way that you described the warmth, this sort of intrinsic warmth and connection that a lot of people feel with Africa, when I think back to my experiences, I did very much have that experience in Africa, but my experience of South America, I felt was much more of a physical wilderness landscape sort of journey, and the language was far easier to deal with than in all the varied languages of the Middle East and Africa, so I could communicate much more clearly and much more easily. And it strikes me now when I think back of the different continents, I just think of South America as being about beautiful, wild campsite. So enjoying being out in the middle of nowhere, no one on the planet knows where I am, and that just feels great. Sometimes it feels awful, but the fine line between solitude and loneliness, I reveled in the just times out places like the Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia, or the Andes Mountains, or the beautiful greenery of Colombia, just thinking, wow, this is a wonderful, beautiful, natural, wild land to be cycling up for a year or so.
I absolutely agree. It is one of the most spectacular places I've ever been, and haven't been anywhere near enough to South America. Asia equally is so different, so big. A lot of people talk about it being quite difficult in places to travel. Is there something that challenged you perhaps and made you think, how am I going to keep going? How did you find the motivation and I suppose the discipline to do that?
Riding through Siberia in the wintertime was physically really grueling. The temperature's down to minus 40 degrees, literally on the other side of the planet from my home. Minus 40, freezing cold, sleeping in a tent, pretty grinding and brutal. And so the kindness of people then was amplified a lot. And although Siberia is huge and empty, there's small villages dotted along the way. So my memories now of Siberia are a mixture of these empty, ridiculously cold nights in the middle of nowhere, alternating with times when I get to a little village and be showered with the most kindness I'd encountered since I cycled through the Middle East. And in light of the news that we always see on TV, it really strikes me regularly that the two parts of the world where I felt the most welcomed as a stranger and outsider were in the Middle East and in Russia. Two parts of the world that are often in the news for less cheerful reasons these days. But Siberia is a tough place. It was one of the saddest areas I went through in terms of just seeing the crumbling of society, how these communities that had been propped up by the Soviet Union for so long were now just being forgotten and neglected and often literally falling apart. Bridges falling down across rivers that meant you could some places only access once the rivers froze in wintertime. So it was a hard landscape, hard drinking, hard, tough, scary people often, but also this undercurrent of warmth. And a small incident that I think summed up those wild, crazy 3 months as well as anything was one night cycling along. I say night because I was on a race to get out of Russia before my visa ran out. So I was having to push on into darkness most evenings. And it was pretty hard when the road is covered in snow and it's freezing and you've got to find somewhere to put your tent up. And a car passed and it stopped. And that was a very common occurrence. People would usually stop and they'd chat like, what on earth are you doing, you crazy guy, on your bicycle in the middle of winter? But in this time, the difference was that the couple of guys that got out were completely drunk on vodka, which wasn't uncommon. But what was unusual was that one of them had a gun and robbed me at gunpoint, which is a horrible experience and the only time in the whole world that I got robbed. And I was really angry because I was so looking forward to being able to say what a great place Russia was and how it was countering so many preconceptions. And then this happens and this idiot, and I was really furious. So I gave him my sort of decoy wallet with a bit of cash in, but at the same time, I was lost. I didn't really know where I was. So once he'd nicked my wallet, I then asked for help. And so he then we got out my map, and he was very kind and helpful, giving me directions and helping me navigate. And then off he went. And that really summed up to me Russia. There's this sort of slight air of craziness, but in a good-hearted, warm person at the depth of it all as well.
That's an amazing story. I absolutely love that. How did it feel to return home, and kind of what perspectives and insights did you gain from this trip that you took forward into your life and career?
I think a lot of people spend a lot of time planning their adventures and their travels and going into all sorts of careful preparation. But nobody pays much attention to what happens after the journey. And I now know lots of people who've been on all sorts of big and crazy journeys and expeditions. And without failure, without exception, I think all of us struggle to come home. I think some people go away on adventures because they're running away from something. But of course, eventually you come back and then all those things are still there waiting for you, or you're trying to run away for yourself, but wherever you go, you take yourself with you. Or even if you just go off on an adventure for more cheerful reasons, coming home to a normal, comparatively mundane, regular life can feel like an anticlimax and a come down. So I felt a real mixture of things when I got back from cycling around the world. I'd been away from home for 4 years, so I was delighted to see friends and family again, and to not be a stranger, to not be the weird person that everyone was staring at the whole time, to just be part of an anonymous majority again felt really nice, until it didn't, until it just felt boring again. And I thought, wow, has my life peaked? Is everything for the rest of my life going to seem a pale comparison of those glorious days out on the open road, which already in my mind I was polishing into memories far more vivid and exciting than the often quite boring or frustrating realities of travel. So I found coming home really hard. And to be honest, I'm not sure I've ever quite managed to just live a normal, happy life, because a lot of what I do is measured in comparison to those days cycling around the world. I sometimes feel that if I wanted an interesting life, then I was right to go chasing adventures. But if I wanted a happy life, then maybe I should have just got a normal job and gone on some small adventures in my breaks from work.
Well, and of course you transitioned to that later on in your life and career. So maybe you had the best of both worlds in the end. But I love the way that you kind of pivoted as well. And so I wanted to go to Midsummer Morning. When I first heard about this, I just absolutely loved the idea. It was quite revolutionary to me in many ways. Can you talk about where you were in your life then and your motivation for taking this kind of adventure? What were you seeking?
After cycling around the world, I then started chasing other sorts of big adventures. I wanted to go to different parts of the world and travel in different ways, and travel by myself and with different people. So I wanted all sorts of a real range of journeys. So I walked across southern India and rode across the Atlantic Ocean and across the empty quarter deserts, of quite big traditional sort of expeditions, chasing this notion of an adventurous life. But at some point it started to dawn on me a bit that I was getting quite good at this sort of stuff now. It's not rocket science, so I was getting quite good at having a miserable time, putting up my tent at night and repeating the process the next morning. And I kind of knew now that if I took on a big journey, that I'd probably get to the end of it and succeed at it, which takes away quite a lot of the uncertainty, the risk, the surprise, the sheer adventurousness of the experience. And I wondered whether in my heart, what I was doing now was actually just the easy option, whether in my own way, these adventures were my version of my comfort zone and a bit of a rut. And I tried to dare myself to think a bit differently about what adventure meant to me. And if adventure was about uncertainty and not knowing if you'll succeed and being massively out of your comfort zone and not knowing how things are going to turn out, but with that thrilling small little possibility of, wow, this could be great if it works, then perhaps I needed to do something really different. And back in the 1930s, Laurie Lee walked through Spain playing the violin, sleeping on hills, earning money from his busking. And the book he wrote, As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning, is a beautiful travel book. I've always thought of it as my favorite travel book. And I've always, for about 15 years, I'd been saying, oh, I'd love to do that. I'd love to go and walk through Spain like Laurie Lee. But I can't play the violin at all. I have no musical skill. I hate karaoke or dancing or anything like that. It terrifies me. And so I'd always just dismissed it until now, with my thinking differently about adventure, I realized that the fear that I felt about having to play the violin was exactly what I'd needed if I wanted an adventure now. So I had 6 months of violin lessons. I sounded like a strangled cat. It was absolutely horrific, but I decided to give it a go anyway. And I spent a month walking along Laurie Lee's route through northern Spain to Madrid with no money, no credit card, and only my appalling violin skills to earn some money for the next meal. It was a terrifying, humiliating, ridiculous experience, and it was one of the best and most thrilling adventures of my life.
Oh, I love that so much. And, to go with no money, no safety net and no violent skills is so bold, but is in some ways that having no safety net, the purpose of it, that's what makes it an adventure.
It was absolutely critical in my mind that if I was going to do Laurie Lee's walk through Spain, I needed to go with the violin and no money, no safety net. When I had the idea, I sort of imagined that in 6 months I'd get quite good at the violin and then I'd be able to definitely earn a bit of money. But actually, I was so bad. It's so hard. And just before I set off, I was thinking, no one is going to give me any money. This is a stupid idea. It's just ridiculous. So therefore, what I need to do is take my credit card with me, and I'll play the violin and do all that sort of stuff, but I'll take my credit card. And I realized that if I did that, the entire trip was just a nonsense, really. For the thing, it would have been a sort of novelty holiday, really. But for this to be an adventure, I needed to throw away the safety net of the credit card, and I needed to stand up in that first town square and busk for the very first time, knowing that if I want to eat in the next month, I have to do this and I have to stick at it until I earn a coin. Otherwise, I'm going to get extremely hungry. It was absolutely vital that it was all or bust.
I love that you chose probably literally the hardest instrument too. I know you were kind of following in the footsteps of a violinist player, but yeah, it's incredibly bold. And watching the film as well, that first scene, busking, I feel like you get a sense of that, oh my God, what have I gotten myself in for? It's really funny, but it's also, you kind of get that, you really put into your shoes. And I wonder if you could maybe describe what that first moment was in the square. Like, how did it feel to set up for the first time and start playing?
So Laurie Lee started in a port in northwestern Spain called Vigo, and it was where he got off the boat from England, and it was where I arrived to begin. And it was a fairly typical little quiet, sleepy Spanish town. And when I arrived by plane, and I stayed in an Airbnb. And then the next morning I began. So I walked out of this Airbnb and I had cash. So I lined up the final coins from my pocket on a little park bench in a little pyramid, and I walked off to find a place to busk. And I'd already found what seemed like the perfect place to do it, but when I'd been scouting earlier, but someone was there already and they were playing an instrument. They were playing it really well. I was like, oh no, I can't come and play in this plaza now. Someone's stolen my place. And look at him, he's good. And to be honest, I don't think he was very good. He was playing a penny whistle or something, and he was a bit of a sort of hobo type, and he was a bit rubbish at it. But I now looked at him as though he was some sort of hero, because he was doing what I did not dare do. So I then went to a second-rate little Spanish plaza, and I'd never practiced busking at home. I practiced the violin, but I deliberately didn't practice busking in my hometown because I just wanted maximum immersion, maximum terror on day one. So I set out my violin case like you see proper people do on the street in London. I had my little music stand. I set that up. And the first time I started to play, of course, people start to look at you, and I just felt all these eyes staring on me. So one of those humiliating experiences that just take you back to school days and the shame and embarrassment of everyone staring at you for something. It was terrifying and embarrassing and frightening, and I could still sort of find it funny because I enjoy the sense of the ridiculous, but I was thinking, man, this is utterly ridiculous. No one's going to give me money. And for a couple of hours, I was playing away. I only knew about 5 little tunes, each of about 30 seconds. And I was just looping through these terrible little ditties with people ignoring me, swerving around me, deliberately looking at their phones, clearly blanking me or sort of wrinkling their nose at me in disgust. And I was just shriveling down to this mere shell of a man until eventually an elderly gentleman walked towards me, and I thought he was going to shout at me and tell me to go away because he'd been watching me for ages. And if he'd shouted at me and said, go away, I think that would have broken me and I'd have just quit and thought, right, it was nice to try, but this is too much. It's too hard. But he didn't shout at me. Instead, he reached into his pocket and he pulled out a coin and he gave it to me. And this is one of those just pivotal moments in a journey, because if you've earned 1 coin, you can earn more coins. After that 1 coin, the rest is easy. And it was one of the most thrilling and exciting and rewarding moments of my life. And if I hadn't been so desperate to spend that coin on a loaf of bread, I would love to have kept it as a sort of lucky talisman, because it was a really, really big moment. And that man, he just gave me a small little coin and went on his day. He has no idea what an impact that small act of kindness had. It was wonderful.
That's such a great story. I absolutely love that. And as you went through this journey, I can't remember how long it took, but obviously it takes, a few weeks. Did it get any easier? Was it always scary setting up? Were there moments when you just didn't make enough money?
So it took me a month to walk the 500 miles through the mountainous route to Madrid. And what I could have done was, on that first day when that man gave me a coin, because obviously I then had a bit of confidence, I could have kept playing for the whole day and maybe I'd have earned 10 euros. And with 10 euros, I could have gone and bought enough rice to last me for the entire month, and I could have just walked to Madrid. But that was not the point of what I was trying to do. So what I came up with was an idea that whenever I got money, I had to spend all of it immediately. And that meant that the next day or the next village I got to, I would have no money again, and the process would start again. If I want to eat tonight, I must busk and earn a coin. So I was always nervous. I always found it hard, but nothing is as hard as that first time. It got much easier after that. Some days a couple of days, people would throw a coin in the box before I'd even begun to play. Like, woohoo, this is unbelievably easy. Some days you play for hours before you finally get 50 cents to go and buy a loaf of bread. It's fascinating, the experience of it. One day I was just playing away on a street in a little town, and it really wasn't going very well. And then a tourist bus arrived. A load of Spanish tourists got off and gave me 20 euros. I mean, no man needs 20 euros. That's a ridiculous amount of money. I was like the king of the world. So then I went to a supermarket and I just bought ice cream, beer and biscuits and just had a massive feast, walked out of town. And then, of course, the next morning I'm hungry again with no money in my pocket, and the process begins again.
I have so much respect for you for doing that. I just think that's incredible. And so I feel like that, that was a changing point, obviously in how you approached, adventure and your sense of adventure. But then it was after that you kind of came up with this famous concept of micro adventures. And I think that really changed the world in many ways. That changed people, that kind of opened people's eyes to what adventure could be, and inspired a lot of people to search for that in their own lives. What was your inspiration for that concept of micro adventures? Like, how did that come to be, and what were you hoping to achieve with that?
The idea of micro adventures started to come to me 2 separate ways. One was that when I was off on these big adventures in the desert in Oman, or on an ice cap in Greenland, or in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, these are very different places. But what I was getting out of that experience, all the sort of internal stuff that we get out of adventuring, was exactly the same. And that got me thinking that you can kind of have an adventure anywhere, can't you? Maybe it's more in the mind and the heart than anywhere else. And therefore, perhaps I don't need to go to these distant, expensive places. Maybe I can find it close to home. So that was one aspect. The second aspect was that by now I was getting to the point where I was making a living out of adventure through writing books and giving talks. And therefore that showed me that there's an audience of people out there who really like the idea of adventures. But not many of these people are actually having adventures themselves. Why not? Well, real life, of course. Most people have got jobs and mortgages and commitments and a cat to feed and all this sort of real life stuff. So I started to wonder whether there was a way to get all the good things that I enjoyed about adventure, and presumably all these people who came to my talks enjoyed about adventure, and package it in a way that was short and simple and local and affordable, so that we can do this sort of stuff at the weekends or after work. And the overriding premise of it all was that it's always better to do some adventure than no adventure. Just because you can't do a massive adventure doesn't just mean then that the alternative is to do zero adventures. So trying to just find what opportunities are available for adventure, rather than getting sad about the obstacles and the barriers that are stopping you perhaps having the adventure of a lifetime. So going for a lifetime of living a little bit adventurously rather than just dreaming of one mythical adventure of a lifetime. That was the starting premise to it.
And I got to say, you really inspired me. I obviously heard about this term a while ago, and I live in Colorado, so we go hiking and camping and stuff like that. But I always complain because I've got kids and I've, got this business, and I'm always so busy that I don't get enough of it. And, when I was preparing for this interview, I was like, God, why haven't I thought of that? I'm going to just go winter camping, one night, next week. I'm just going to do these small things and get that nature hit that I've been looking. So, on a personal level, thank you for all the inspiration that you've shared with that. I think it really is an incredible idea.
Thank you.
And so I wonder if you could pick out like one or two stories, and obviously feel free to pick out which ones mean the most to you. One I love though was the story of camping in Austin by the river and these guys coming over and just sharing a night together, because something in that for me represents some of the best pieces of what travel can be. Okay, yeah, I'll tell that story then. So for quite a long time, I would just go and do talks all over the world. And I really enjoyed doing that, but it quite often meant that I'd arrive in some place, do a talk, and then come home again. And it seemed a shame to me that I'd miss out on all this adventure potential. Quite often, I'd be speaking at some sort of business conference, and they'd very kindly put me up in a hotel. And at first, I'm like, woohoo, free hotel, amazing. And I'd steal all the shampoo, woohoo. But eventually, you realise that all of these hotels are exactly the same everywhere in the world, and actually a bit boring. And I realised that what I was doing here was making the mistake of not looking for the opportunities of adventure. So what I've started to try to do it now is whenever I have a talk somewhere that I haven't been before, I try and find a way to just get out and sleep on a hill for a night. So I was doing a talk near Austin in Texas. I'd never been there. Never been to Texas, so I was quite excited. So I arrived in the aeroplane and I got into the hire car, which I was going to use to drive to the event. But rather than just going to stay in some sort of boring hotel and stealing yet more shampoo, I decided that I would just go and have a micro adventure. I'd find somewhere wild to sleep for the night. So, and this might sound like quite a scary idea to people who haven't done it before, but remember I spent 4 years just having to find somewhere to sleep every night. And once you get good at finding places to sleep, you realize that you can pretty much sleep anywhere on the planet. As long as someone hasn't seen you disappear off behind those trees, you're entirely safe. No one knows you're there. And suddenly the darkness becomes your friend and the world is just full of wild camping spots. I love it. I'm really good at it now. It's one of my few skills. So what I would do is I'd drive down the motorway till it was getting towards, say, sunset time, and then I'd just pull off and I'd just follow my nose down random little country roads until eventually I found a bridge going over a river.
I always like bridges going over rivers because they're a great chance to look out the window and look down. Is there a wild swimming spot here? Is there maybe a good secluded place to camp? Yeah, this place looked great for both. A little creek running through a little wood in Texas, perfect. So I parked the car and I went down, and it was a little sandy beach. And I rolled out my bivvy bag and my sleeping bag. I was pretty tired and jet lagged. So I lit a fire on the beach, and I was just sitting there listening to the evening sounds of Texas, and different birds that I wasn't used to, different insects chirping away. And I was thinking, this is great. And no one knows I'm here, so I'm very safe. And then gradually I start to hear country music, quietly at first, and gradually getting louder. And then paddling down the river towards me comes this canoe, and on there are 3 or 4 young lads, so guys in their early 20s, country sort of guys. They've been drinking beer and fishing, having a good old time, and clearly enjoying themselves. But to be honest, when I saw them, I was like, I didn't really want anyone to know I'm here. And they're like, hey, what are you doing here? And I'm like, oh, hello, I'm from England, and I've just got off the aeroplane, and I'm now sleeping by this river. And they clearly thought this was the strangest thing they'd ever heard. So they started chatting to me, and I thought, right, I'll have a friendly chat with them, and then hopefully they'll go away and leave me so I can go to sleep. But they were like, wow, you're amazing. You're from England. We're going to go and get a McDonald's and get some whiskey and come back. So they went off and got a McDonald's and some whiskey and came back. And it was fascinating. They were 3 young guys, and they were all about to join the US Army, and they were nervous about getting shipped off to places like Afghanistan, Middle East, Europe. They'd never been anywhere in the world before, and they were just asking me questions about all these places in the world. And we had a fantastic evening just sitting by this fire. And then they went home, and I slept by the fire and woke up at dawn, and I drove off to some anonymous sort of conference centre, smelling like smoke, but having had a fantastic travel experience just by choosing to try and look for the opportunities that you can find adventure in lots of places. It was brilliant.
Such a brilliant story. And you know those 3 guys are telling that story, they're dining out that story, story for the rest of their life, aren't they? And, I'd say that's a great example of being opportunistic and, just creatively thinking about stuff like that, and the fact that you can do it anywhere. But for some people, that will still also be quite daunting. They'll be like, oh, he's gone and done that. You also do a lot of work with people just to do smaller things closer to home. What are some examples that you've had that you absolutely love?
Yeah, so telling that story now, I'm conscious of the privilege I have in order to be on a riverbank in the middle of nowhere where no one in the world knows where I am, and for 3 guys to turn up and to have a fun evening. And I'm very aware that I'm a middle-class, white, tall, athletic and handsome man, and that things could have been very different potentially had I been all sorts of other sorts of demographics. So there is definitely a privilege to that sort of adventuring. So I think then a lot of it also just comes from my confidence over years and years of doing this sort of stuff. So I do see that it's hard for a lot of people to get started in adventuring. So a simpler idea than flying to the other side of the world and finding a creek is I've spent a lot of time encouraging people who are busy with their 9-to-5 working lives to just try and park the idea that the 9-to-5 block shot adventure, and instead to just do a little thought experiment of flipping that round and wondering about instead the 5-to-9, the 16 hours of hypothetical freedom that we have each day when we finish work. And of course, people have commitments and real life, of course, but hypothetically, I think it's interesting that we don't often consider this as adventure time. We just see it as, time to sleep before I go back to work. So I've spent a lot of time trying to encourage people to look for 5-to-9 micro adventures. When you finish work one evening, head out of your town, wherever you live. You're never more than, say, an hour from nice countryside, and go sleep on a hill for the night, sleep under the stars, wake up in the morning, come back down the hill, have a quick swim in a river, and then head back to work for 9 o'clock. And loads of people have been doing that. It's simple, it's easy, it's great. But I'm very conscious that there'll still be a lot of people who are like, whoa, that still sounds pretty epic and scary for me. So then I've been making things even simpler to say, well, why don't you just go sleep in your garden, sleep in your backyard for the nights, just sleep outside your house? And I did that when I was writing my micro-adventures book. And to be honest, I felt a bit silly. When I was a kid, I used to love sleeping in the backyard, in the garden. But as an adult, it felt very silly to be just pulling my perfectly good duvet and pillow outside and lying down just outside my front door. And yet, once you're lying there, you see the stars, you hear the wind blowing through the trees, you hear the owls, the birds singing at night, the nighttime creatures. You really get pretty much, I'd say, 70% of the experience that you would if you were camping on some distant hilltop. It's outdoors, it's something a bit different. And then what's really important about it is when you wake up in the morning, you think, oh, that was great. And it actually wasn't that hard, and it wasn't that scary, and I wasn't scared of ghosts. So maybe next week I can go try sleeping on the local hill. So making things so unbelievably small that you personally feel comfortable to do it, and then starting to build up some confidence and momentum from that. I think that's the key towards getting going on adventures.
That's great. It reminds me of one of the maddest things I've ever done, which is a thing called Camp in My Garden. And I basically walked the Capitol Ring, which is this 80 mile something footpath around London, camping in strangers' back gardens along the way. It was absolutely mad. I made so many amazing friends.
With permission?
Yeah. They sign up to this thing. This was a few years ago, but they sign up to this thing a little bit like couch surfing. Yeah. So I kind of booked all these different strangers' houses and just sort of turned up. It was incredibly...
That's a great idea.
Yeah. It was so much fun. Yeah. So like maybe there's a way that you could kind of segue from micro adventures to the concept of local, and how you came up with that and why that was an important thing for you to do.
I realized that over lots of years I'd got to know, I don't know, Uzbekistan or Bolivia or places like this, and yet I didn't really know some town 5 miles down the road from where I lived that I'd never been to before. So I wondered whether I could find some interesting places close to home. And I'd been doing micro adventures for a lot of years now, looking for places to have adventurous experiences close to home. But I didn't really know where I live. I also have a tendency to wish that I was in other places. So I talked to you and oh man, I wish I lived in Colorado. You're so lucky. You must have much more adventures than me. I wish that I was there. Where I live is rubbish. And I've quite a negative attitude towards where I live, which is a fairly boring suburban landscape just outside a big city. And that's not a very useful approach to have to life. So I wondered then whether I could address that by getting to know where I live a bit more deeply. And then the other thing that I was trying to mull over was, how can I find a way to try and help more people have more outdoor experiences more often wherever they happen to live? And so all these ideas were whirring around my head. And I decided to try and challenge myself to spending a whole year just exploring the single map that I live on. All of Britain is divided up into Ordnance Survey maps, the sort of maps you'd use for hiking, and they cover about 20 kilometres by 20 kilometres, so about 12 miles by 12 miles. And they're maps divided up into individual grid squares, little blue 1 kilometre grid squares. So I decided to see whether I could spend a whole year only on this one map that I live on. And what I would do to get to know it is I would go out each week and I would explore just one isolated kilometre grid square in as much depth as I possibly could. Now, when I had this idea, I thought this might be quite a rubbish idea and quite boring, because I'm full of wanderlust. I always want to go to new places, and I thought I'd be quite bored and the map would be very restrictive. However, once I committed to going out each week and exploring a small area in more detail and paying more attention than I'd ever done before, I soon realised that actually this map was enormous and there was no way I could begin to know everything about where I lived in a year. And the interesting phenomenon was, the more I started to pay attention, the more I realised was out there and available. And the closer I looked at something small, the bigger and bigger the map became. And it turned into a fascinating year of opening my eyes to nature that I'd never knew existed. It woke me up to the massive problems we have in the UK and the world of loss of wildlife, loss of wild places, and enthused me to try and commit to helping the natural world in a way that crossing continents and deserts and oceans never quite managed to do. Sorry, that was a very long and rambling answer.
No, it wasn't. And by the way, I think you're the least rambling and most articulate person I've ever interviewed and concise. So it's absolutely amazing. I can tell you do a bunch of this stuff, of course. So if you were to kind of tease, like you're down the pub, you're with your mates and you want to just sort of tease the book, what would be a couple of those experiences that you would share?
The first week of exploring my map, when I thought that this was maybe a really terrible idea and that I should give up on it, I decided to go and explore what looked to be the most boring grid square on my map. So I looked carefully at my map and I found a place that had nothing on it. There were no roads, no contour lines, and no big hills, there were no rivers, there were no interesting looking woodlands or footpaths. It just looked like an empty bit of nothing. So I went there early one morning and started to just try to pay attention to every single thing that I saw. And once I started to do that, once you see one little thing, you then notice there are lots more little things and more little things and more little things. And I came away from that just realizing that there was so much to see, even in a supposedly empty grid square. So a small example of that would be I decided that I wanted to try to learn more about nature. And to do that, I have an app on my phone called Seek, made by iNaturalist, which is one of those clever apps that you point at a plant or an insect or an animal and it tells you what it is. It tells you the name of it. And once you start to know the name of something, then you start to notice it in more places and you get more of a connection to it. You start to care about it. You start to get a bit more interested in it. And so what I did here was to point it at little plants and learn their names. And that then got me thinking of just the sheer scale of nature and wildlife that was even on this anonymous little grid square, let alone across the rest of my country or continent or world, which then got me mulling over the fact that, oh, wow, look, up there I can see the sun and that's in the solar system. And then I realized that there's thousands and thousands of solar systems and galaxies. And before I knew it, I'd just blown my mind with the realization that I'm in a lucky position whereby I can go pretty much anywhere on the planet and explore and have adventures. But how the heck do I choose where to go when everywhere is so rich and interesting? And given that enormous conundrum of trying to choose where to go, maybe the simplest thing to do is just explore where I am right now, right this very minute, and to allow myself to be filled with awe and astonishment and wonder at all this right now. And there's more within this one little square mile than I can ever begin to take in. So why on earth do I need to go disappearing off to different continents? Perhaps it's enough to just pay attention and be astonished and find that wherever you happen to be.
That's absolutely beautifully said. And, you know, it sounds like exploring local is, you know, the kind of message to that, what a reader might get out of that is that sense of gratitude of where you live and perhaps that kind of deeper connection and community. Do you feel that adventure in general, like just spending time outdoors, do you find that that is a kind of catalyst for connecting us more deeper with the land, with nature, and perhaps in doing so, you know, become better stewards for it and caring for it more and understanding it more, you know, become better stewards of it? And I always feel like the first step in conservation is falling in love with the outdoors. And that's a step that's often ignored. Is that something you can relate to?
When I was doing my really big expeditions, I loved that they were in beautiful, wild, natural places. But those natural landscapes were very much like a green screen to my own experiences. I was having a fantastic time in this beautiful place, but I didn't really give much thought to that place. This year, by scheduling that within the busyness of my normal daily life, I was going to commit to going out once a week to somewhere really close to where I live, and I was going to explore it. That made me connect to the land far more deeply than cycling across a continent ever did. And I think having that regularity of time outdoors was really helpful, because from that you come to notice the seasons changing, and you start to notice your place within the seasons and within the year, and then grow a connection from that. And a lot of the places that I was wandering around aren't particularly beautiful as sort of falling down factories, but with trees starting to grow through the cracks in the pavement, and flowers and the butterflies that are flying around the broken brickwork, that I started to think, wow, this is beautiful and this is worth caring about. And the more that I realized how little nature there is in Britain, how much has been lost, made me treasure what is there even more, and made me more passionate to try and say, hey, we've got to do something about this. We've got to start to turn this all around. And you don't start to shout about stuff until you care about it. And you don't start to care about somewhere until you feel connected to it. And you don't start to feel connected somewhere until you notice it. And you don't notice it until you go there, and you go there regularly, and you go there consciously and slowly to just pay attention to what you're experiencing right now. Not to be scrolling through your phone's Instagram feed and listening to music on your headphones, to just sit on a log in a wood or in a broken down bit of factory and just sit there for a little bit and notice it. And from that, the noticing comes the love, comes the caring, and then you get this wonderful positive feedback loop of the more you see, the more you notice, the more you care, the more you see, and round it goes.
Round and round it goes in this positive cycle. And for those of you hardcore listeners who make it to the very end of the episode, literally the last line, thank you, firstly, you might recognize that sentiment. We didn't confer. I didn't nick it from him. It's just true, and it applies to wonder as well. So that's what I talk about at the end of the episode. So thank you so much, Alastair. You guys can follow him on Instagram, Al_Humphreys, to see what he's up to. Lots of cool stuff he posts there. You can sign up to that free newsletter that I talked about at alastairhumphreys.com. And while you're there, just check out all the books he's written. There's so many cool ones there, but that last one he was talking about at the end of the interview, it's called Local, A Search for Nearby Nature and Wildness. So thanks so much for listening, guys. Our newsletter, which is nowhere near as good as Alastair's, because his is so good. I'm trying very hard. Ours is okay. It's pretty good. I think you'll like it. And you can sign up to it at armchair-explorer.com, and you can follow me on social at armchair-explorer podcast. So from bad violin playing to just camping in your backyard, finding those micro adventures, look for adventure and look for wonder, because the more we look for wonder in the world, the more the wonder of the world becomes a part of who we are. Dare to be truly alive. This episode was presented by Aaron Miller, that's me, and Charles Tyree did the audio editing and production. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll see you next time.
Quick question. Do you want travel tips from people who have actually been there?
Our show is co-hosted by Tim Johnson, an award-winning travel journalist who's been to more than 145 countries around the world. And I'm David Brody, the other co-host who's been travel podcasting for 20 years while traveling to 50-plus countries around the world.
In about 10 or 20 minutes per show, we break down a destination with the kind of insight you usually only get from long guidebooks or hours of research.
So if you want expert advice, zero fluff, and travel inspiration that you can actually use, search for Travel in 10 wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can also find us at voyescape.com.
Hi, I'm Pauline Fromer, host of the Fromer's Travel Podcast. We post new episodes weekly, detailing the kinds of money-saving tips and cultural insights that will make your trips richer without making you significantly poorer. We do so by interviewing real travel experts like TV host Samantha Brown, Fromer's authors from around the globe, and such public figures as Free Solo's Alex Honnold. It's a fun travel party. I hope you can join us.